Well, thank you all for coming. I'm very honored to be able to share the story of James. Uh, I'm formed really by belonging to a family, a small family unit that was bound together, and I'll kind of unpack that a little bit after I introduce the the people involved. The first person I would say is my mother, Barbara June Bernard, and she was born in 1928 in Oakland, California. Her family had come from Missouri, and she and her sister, my auntie Julia, were both had many Missouriisms in their vocabulary as we grew up. Uh, I'll come back to her in a minute. My father, James William Ford, was born in 1919 in uh, New Jersey, and was and this kind of important. He was orphaned very young. He was passed around among relatives. He ended up in an orphanage. We believe his stories were not always consistent. He ended up on the streets of Manhattan, made his living probably selling newspapers, and then drifted into petty crime, lower ranks of crime, the criminal world. Julia was born in 1935, I believe, 1934. And we, in later years when she lived with us, we called her the Hobbit. And she will continue in, but she's important to me as sort of junior mother when I be born. Their parent, Barbara and Julia's parents, were Boline and Donald. And Donald was maybe the only, Donald Lauren Bernard was the only person who maybe went to college. We're pretty sure he did, although he doesn't appear to have graduated. There's some incident apparently where a train was stolen for a joyride, and the only person who didn't come from money got expelled. He made his living. Well, we'll come back to that. Boline is the spiritual matriarch of the family, and she was born and raised in Missouri. She's an independent Baptist of the most fundamentalist sort, a prayer warrior and a deaconess. We constantly moved. My father was a never quite got out of the petty criminal kind of thing, and we moved constantly. And so the people I knew were these people and my brother, and we mainly lived in California, but we crossed the country several times, and the family would kind of break up into my Boline and Donald and Julia and us, and then come back together and move. But I never went to the same high school I never went to a high school. I never went to a school for 2 years. So my brother Donald was born a year after me in 1949, and he in San Francisco, California. I was born in Oakland, California, in 1948, and that's the family. In my notes, I do want to tag here that in my somewhere in my childhood, I have nobody to check. Everybody here except me is dead. And so, and I have a dreadful memory. I mentioned earlier in a different context that if you want to have a decent funeral, you should have daughters, because the boys tend to think maybe your parents were born, and get vague after that really fast. Here I am. Somewhere in my 10-ish, I had rheumatic fever. I got out of bed, fell down, and that led to a year more or less in bed. During which time I acquired a taste for reading, and my maternal grandmother was a major caregiver, and my main memory of that time is her praying with me. So I have these various moments in my lives that marked me considerably, and I've written them down, and I'll share them as they pop up here in the notes. I was 9 or 10, lying stretched out on the living room floor reading the Sunday funnies. Suddenly it occurred to me to ask, what would the cartoons look like if I were a Martian and had never seen such a thing before? I turned the page upside down and noticed how the shapes were formed, particularly how the cartoons were contained in boxes. And I realized that it didn't have to be so. It was just how someone decided to put it together. I believed it was here that I found the deep curiosity that would goad me on to the spiritual journey. I'd found a what if it isn't this way, but perhaps another. Somewhere, well, I know actually, I was 13. Um, um, my father we were living in Hemet, California, and my father was managing a liquor store. And some friend of his said, I just need to borrow the money over the weekend. And he went to jail for a year for that. And that's the first time I became aware of these other things. I took to bed. My mother didn't know what to do. She sent me up to Oakland to be with my grandmother and auntie. And we lived in East Oakland, and my major memory of the time was going to school. There might have been other white kids. I don't remember any. And being beaten up the first day, and being beaten up the second day, and then realizing how to hide. And that kind of marked a year. My father got out of jail, and he found his calling. He became an itinerant bartender, which kind of worked for considering his true love. Somewhere in this kind of area around 14 or so, we were living in a suburban house, and there was a garage with boxes, and I remember with a couple of friends rummaging around in the boxes, hoping to find my father's Playboy magazines. And what I found was a catch of Edgar Rice Burroughs novels with those Frazetta covers on them, if some people know them. I believe At the Earth's Core, which was a minor fantasy series that he wrote. And it was like the first book I know I picked for myself, even though it was wasn't a Playboy, but at least, it had a half-naked people on the cover. And I loved it. It just really, really captured me. And I have been a reader ever since. And I'll say that's one thing that was in the family that was really important. Everybody was a reader. My mother read murder mysteries, my father science fiction. There was always piles of books wherever we lived. There were always piles. And Auntie loved comic books. She actually was an omnivore, but what I mainly remember is comic books. And so it took me a while to find Marvel because she preferred well, she liked funny animals and Archie and Veronica and all of it. And so between the comic books, the science fiction, I didn't have a taste at the time for mysteries, but there was always something to read. Religion was a current through the family. My father was, a drunk and we were on the road, and stability came through my through bullying, and she would the Spirit would lead us to the right church, which always tended to be an independent fundamentalist Baptist church, and the anchor to my life often was religion. That was the only stable point that I knew about. And um, my earliest memories of a coherent thing to be was a minister, because men were either drunks and criminals or ministers. A couple of Sunday school teachers. And so I really lived into that. It was really important. We were a poor people's Baptist. So we knew that rich people were all going to hell. The anecdote from Jesus about how it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich person go to heaven was not encumbered by any liberal mishmash or low gates and a side, on the side, or ropes, it meant rich people were going to hell. And as near as from later as I grew older, my guess is the line for rich was kind of middle management. So it, it shaped me, and the questions of, religion shaped me. And then, of course, I'm now in my early adolescence, and I'm not exactly sure when, but in my mid-adolescence, the great questions of meaning and purpose began to well up in me as some unavoidable barrier. Without passing it, I felt I could not meet life. The way I framed it in that moment was, is there a God? It rushed out of my childhood religion and the constant Greek chorus of my father's mockery of the whole thing. I came to a moment when I stood in the backyard and I looked up to the heavens and I prayed, God, if you're real, show yourself. I prayed with all my heart. I squeezed my eyes shut. I could feel tears oozing from the meeting point of my eyelids. I added with a fervor perhaps only an adolescent can muster, if you show yourself in the next moment, you can kill me. I prayed so hard, and I was met with silence. So this is an abiding part of my life and a shape there. Realized somewhere in these years, I began trying to write, and fortunately, there are no surviving examples. Some execrable short stories. I had for a short time lost in one of the moves, a small collection of rejection slips from Reader's Digest, for those little humorous anecdotes that they would do. I have two other big markers from this era, and one taught me the vagaries of memory as well as sadness. My father was in prison when the war began, and then was released into the army in the last year. But because he was a criminal, he wasn't allowed to have a gun. He was a medic, and it was something he was always ashamed of. And he, even though he was in combat and without with a first aid kit, I mean, it's pretty incredible. But he never saw it that way. But there was a battle in Italy. His lieutenant, John Fuller, was hit with shells, fell. My father was tending to him. Through what was left of his face, the lieutenant asked him to kill him. And my father ran away. For the rest of his life, if he get really drunk, he would relive this thing. And he would sometimes fall, and I can remember holding him so he wouldn't suffocate. And um, and I have that memory. It is in my bones to this day. The other thing from this, towards the end of my adolescence, um, I walked into the bathroom, and my father had hung himself, and I saw him. He had used a belt, and I looked at him, and I, as 16-year-olds, turned around and walked out the door. My mother came up to the door, saw what was happening, screamed. I went back in, lifted him up, and she took him down, and he survived. Uh, I uh, uh, think occasionally about what would have happened if what my memories and feelings would be after that. At 17, I dropped out of high school and joined the Marines. And I was not a good Marine. And uh, I was uh, uh, went through boot camp, then was before being assigned to the school, and I think they asked me what I want to be. I said a writer, and so I was assigned to be a teletype operator, which was something that you carried on your back, and something awful, but before that, I was assigned to 30 days of kitchen duty. And the second day, somebody came in and said they needed a typist. And I had taken typing in junior high school, and I could type on a manual computer. I could type 60 words a minute. When I got these things, it was 100, but these didn't exist. And so I slipped into this liminal spot where I was a typist in an office in the Marine Corps Depot for months. And how did I went out to do on leave, and I overstayed it, and then um, 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 didn't go back. Yeah. An AWOL. When I did come back, I was um, given 30 days in the brig, and then I was assigned to go back to the teletype school, and another incident, I went AWOL, and I went up to my parents, and they hired a psychologist. In later times, I don't know where they have no idea where the money came from. I have no idea where they even thought of something like this. And they I was just got an honorable discharge for being terminally adolescent. And so 13 months, from soup to nuts, I was an honorably discharged veteran. I, at my parents' house, took to bed, read the entire collection of Sherlock Holmes's stories, and got out of bed and looked for a job. And I went to work in Holmes Book Company in Oakland, California. One of those one-time great monumental bookstores. It was used and new and rare, and it just and magnificent shop. They hired me in the shipping department, and then I went on to the sales floor, and it became my first school. And I still remember reading the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in 3 different translations, starting with the Fitzgerald. but very poor. And I had lunch were those little, I think there's versions they call Lunchables now, like a little processed cheese and crackers. And the sad thing is that I can't open a copy now of the Rubaiyat without smelling processed cheese. Um, I discovered Aldous Huxley, and I really loved his everything he wrote, but especially he wrote these kind of novels of manners, these kind of drawing room, things, and I don't know, I loved them. And through him, I discovered Gerald Hurd, who was another English intellectual. All of these people ended up in Hollywood, and Hurd was really interested in Vedanta. And then he infected all these people. And through the two of them, I discovered Christopher Isherwood. And Isherwood, I adored. And he wrote very accessible books about Vedanta, and translated the Bhagavad Gita with his teacher, the Bhagavad Gita, and several other Hindu classics. I thought, this is really cool. And maybe, and it was kind of a religious thing that seemed to make some sense, especially as washed through these English intellectuals. And I went to the Oakland, the Berkeley Vedanta Society, and they had pews. And I couldn't stay. I was so offended by the pews that I left. I especially was drawn to Christopher Isherwood's writings about Vedanta and Swami Vivekananda and his guru, Sri Ramakrishna. I felt a connection to my distant yet constant prayer, is God real? Ramakrishna prayed constantly for a vision of his goddess, Kali, the Divine Mother. He wanted to know her as she was, desperately. I understood. It was my own longing. I was living with the silence I received, but his prayers were answered. One day, unbidden, she came to him. In a vision as he watched, she arose out of a river and walked toward him. As she walked, the goddess swelled out in pregnancy, gave birth, and then ate her child. Witnessing this, he slipped into a fever of ecstasy. As a young man, really still a boy, I was shocked that this would be a turning point in this revered saint's life. It seemed so awful, so terrible. And it opened something for me. I realized my original question was framed wrong. The God I wanted to know was real, wasn't. It was some kind of projection of human beings, of human longing and being into the heavens. But there was another way of asking, a more correct way, it felt to me. What is God? If a koan is an assertion about reality wrapped up together with an invitation, I'd found my own personal, deepest koan. What is God? Bay Area, late 1960s. I'm visiting all the gurus and teachers, and people kept saying Shunryu Suzuki. It was this Zen missionary came over to serve a Japanese community and Japanese descent community mix, and the hippies started in 1957, and the hippies started coming, beatniks started coming, then hippies, and there was a substantial Zen center at the time, and I finally decided I'd go. My girlfriend and I dropped acid, and we hitchhiked over to San Francisco. Fortunately, we ended up in Hippie Park, Hippie Hill, and the next week I took the bus without chemical assistance. Was given the basic instruction on how to sit, and ushered into an interview with the teacher who was one of the staff teachers. It wasn't Shunryu Suzuki, it was Dainan Katagiri. sensei at the time. And he said, "How long have you been sitting?" And I said, "5 minutes." And he said, "Keep that in mind." And as I left, they gave me a little sheet of paper that had the list of associated sitting groups, and there was one in Berkeley, and I sat for the next year in with the Berkeley Zendo, as it was called then. And it was I still have these vivid memories. It was the Zendo. The hall was on the attic of a house, and you walked up a central staircase, and the eaves were open, and they had chicken wire to keep critters out. And then they'd created little soji screens that ran about maybe 3 feet high, 2 or 3 feet high. And in the Soto style, you sit facing the wall. So I have this vivid memory, the smell of sandalwood incense, and the wall turning from black to white as the light, the dawn came up. It was just very sweet. I didn't know Mel Weitzman, who was in charge there, was my teacher, because, at first he was just a lay person. And after that, he wore a black robe, so he wasn't anybody important. Um, um, and, and how he lit the candles, how he led the chants, and how he bowed. I can picture it today. Yeah. He was my second spiritual teacher after my grandmother. I decided if I ordained a Zen priest, all my problems would be fixed. The problem was the San Francisco Zen Center had expectations. They were an institution and they wanted people to do things. So I felt stymied. And then Jiu Kinnett blew into town. And she was she was an English woman who went to Japan, spent 7 years training there, was ordained a Soto Zen priest. Actually, she was given the first Westerner to be in charge of a Japanese temple, and she got a charter to go back to London and start a Zen center. And she stopped at the San Francisco Zen Center, which was the first example of a very successful mission, even though it was accidental. But she stayed there a little bit. She looked around, and there are a lot of things you can say about Jiu Kinnett. Many of them are not good, but she was really smart. And she thought about London, and she thought about California. And she moved into a flat on Potrero Hill and announced she was receiving. And I was her first student. I was the first person at the door.
Can you say her name again?
Hoang Jiu Kinnett, Jiyu Kinnett, Ke, 2 N's and 2 T's. There is Josh Barron says he was the first person to the door, but he's wrong. And this shifted here for me for a lot of things. I started sitting intensely. I was in the flat. Then she decided she needed to go to England and finish up affairs. And so I was told I was invited to move into the flat and pay the rent. But I couldn't come with a girlfriend. So she said, "So get married." And I told my girlfriend I didn't think I wanted to get married. She said, "That's fine, I'll kill myself." And so we got married. And I've never forgotten that. It was a cascade of sadness for many people. More on that later. What's really important for me in that moment as a person on the spiritual journey, who had been given some basic instruction, meditation, and had, I would go to Zazen in the early morning and as likely as not smoke a joint on the way home. So it was not what one would call a mature practice. Miosen Delport was in charge, and she was an Afrikaner, South African, who had left her abusive home to study karate in Japan. She settled in, was very successful in her studies. A young man took an interest in her, but she had other things in her mind, so he hung himself. Not long after his ghost began to visit her, she took this haunting to the local Buddhist priest at the Shin temple. He said he didn't do much with ghosts and instead suggested speaking to the foreign priest at the Zen temple. She went there and met Kenneth Roshi, who said, I can fix this. She showed Miosen how to sit in the Zen style, sat her in the temple's Hondo, the Buddha hall, and had her sit there day in and day out. Every once in a while, the Roshi would come in and violently strike the young woman across the shoulders with a kyosaku. We were talking about kyosaku earlier. A stick made for the purpose of startling, punishing, or encouraging people in meditation halls. Depending on the pronunciation, the stick was said to awaken or to warn. In this case, it was to drive her forward. It did. The ghost moved on to easier pickings, and Miosen had learned how to help someone just sit in a serious way. So there we were. When I wasn't working, I was sitting every morning, every evening, and much of every weekend. Me sitting on a pillow on the ground facing the wall, no longer breath counting, now just sitting. While periodically Miosen would come into the small zendo with her kyosaku and hit my shoulders hard. Earlier draft, I said, beat the shit out of me. Here in my practice, I began to lose everything. My breath counting ended, then my hope ended, then my doubt ended. This hard practice of being present, fully committed to just this, just now, just sitting, drove me forward. It drove me inward. It focused everything on just sitting. I was deeply present, open to everything. Things began, as we would say in my youth, to percolate. I don't recommend this method for anybody, but it is what I had. So getting into this, we got a phone call from the Roshi saying that she was bringing an entourage from England. So we found a large house in Oakland and moved the temple there, stretching my whatever I was making at the time. I was working at Tiffany's, wrapping presents for rich people, and later driving a delivery truck. In Oakland, she arrived. She had I forget how many, there's like 10 people with her, and the monastery got going. She had her first ordinations. I was one of 6 people in 2 batches of three who were ordained unsui tokuda, clouds and water people, novice Zen monks. Quite an exciting time in there. Many people came through, and in our time, I did want to mention too. She at one point the Roshi said that this Korean Zen master was gonna show up for a visit. So, and I was on the guest team at that point, and the door knocked, and I opened the door, and there was this. He was maybe 5'1", and he wasn't Korean. He had long gray hair and a big bushy beard. He was wearing Korean monk robes, and he just pushed past me, walked in, and there's this chubby young man right behind him, and he said, Wally Ollie, take a letter. And then he started narrating what was everything that he was seeing going, and this young kid was trying to write down what he said. Who he was Samuel Lewis, who at the time was called Sufi Sam, and was actually a kind of a new age guy who had been a disciple of a Indian Sufi teacher named Inayat Khan, the first Sufi to teach Westerners in the West. He actually came over to the United States as a musician. He was brought over by the University of California, and where they've had great debates about whether quarter notes were sophisticated or just the instruments were out of tune. So, and he was a Sufi in what they called five school Sufism, and he admitted people into his order without requiring them to convert to Islam. So it's kind of interesting. Samuel Lewis was one of those people and succeeded in that tradition. But he met a Korean among his travels. He met a Korean Zen master named Dr. Shobian Ko, and he in the conversation with him, the Zen teacher said, "You know, you're enlightened," and he gave him Dharma transmission in the Korean tradition. So he's a very interesting, eccentric character. Alan Watts came to visit us a lot, and the first time he came, he showed up at the door. He was in a kimono. He had a very young woman and a very young man with him. As he came in, I realized he was intoxicated. And while he was we had the visiting, his kimono kept coming open, and he wore boxer shorts. And the young man and the young woman, were clearly prepared to do anything he wanted. It was an interesting character, and he became a regular feature. Usually he was sober, but fascinating character. The monastery, while it was still in Oakland, it was deep into sesshin, an intensive 7-day meditation retreat. Mostly what I recall from those days was being hungry. And the main feature of dinner was a thin miso and vegetable soup. I quickly slurped down all the vegetables long before I felt slightly full. Feeling sorry for myself, I swirled the spoon in the broth and I lifted it up. I was surprised to see a large cabbage leaf sitting in the spoon. And then it happened. I felt waves of gratitude wash over me for the cabbage leaf, for the spoon, for my companions, for the moon, for the planet that supported us all, for the whole blessed cosmos. Then just gratitude, wave after wave of gratitude, eternity. And then even that fell away. No cabbage leaf, spoon, companions, room, planet, cosmos. And then I put the spoon to my mouth and ate the cabbage leaf. I went and told the teacher about this, and she said, "Oh, that's interesting. Now you're officially a beginner." During this period, I also had my first publishing opportunity. Alan Watts had put the Roshi into touch with Pantheon Publications, which is a Random House affiliate, and they published a book for her called it was called Selling Water by the River, and she had me ghost the foreword to that, and I thought I did a very good pastiche of Geo Kinnett's writings. She was very intrusive. She was very insightful. She was very, well credentialed. She was very intrusive. She was very controlling. As years would go, the community would get tighter, and it had very cultic elements to it. And at one point, she had a series of visions, and people followed it or didn't. But I was gone long before that. The dime had kind of dropped on to me that the dime that dropped was we moved up to Mount Shasta, and she gave me Dharma transmission. And at that time, I was thinking, why? I wanted it. I was happy to have it, but why? I had some experiences, but why? Yeah. And we left. And shortly after I'd left the Buddhist monastery I'd been living in for several years, I went to Oregon to visit my brother. He lived in a rural area, and I found myself at the edge of a genuine wilderness. I sat down in the shade beside a creek. I can still taste the air from that day. I can smell the warmth in the vegetation. At the very same time, the area was deeply silent and abuzz with life. Then, in the midst of it all, something caught my attention. On a sunny spot on a good-sized rock in the middle of the creek, I watched as a large, fat toad hopped up, settled down, and started sunning itself. All was right with the universe. What I didn't notice until just as it struck was the snake. My heart leapt into my throat. I was frozen to the spot as I witnessed it. In a bloody moment, snake and frog fortunately fell behind the rock, out of sight. Minutes later, the snake slithered up onto the rock in the same place with a large swelling in its middle and lazed in the same sunny spot. In an unbidden moment, I recalled Kali and Ramakrishna and that horrific and now somehow for me personally deeply beautiful vision. I felt my heart grabbed like that snake grabbed the frog. And most important, I felt myself swallowed whole by the goddess of life and death. I realized sitting there in the shade, witnessing it all, that I too was swallowed by the world itself. For me, there was some mysterious truth I was finding unfolding in the play of life and death. I felt this some terrible and beautiful marker. I believed I'd begun to see something of the shape of God. We moved to San Diego, and I got a job at Warren Brock's Book House, which is another of these great historic bookstores. All of them now, of course, long gone. But it was kind of a wonderful time. My son Joshua was born soon after we divorced. They asked me when I went there what I was interested in, and I said, well, religion, Buddhism principally, a little Christianity. And they said, great, you're in charge of Nutsy Cuckoo. And I was in charge of this, the religion section. And my love that thing. I didn't ghost. I saw Gnostica magazine, which was it was more a newspaper kind of format. They kept saying on their masthead that they, witchcraft and earth centered, and I forget everything, and Zen was in the word. So I sent a letter saying I could write a column, and I think that I must have given them a sample or something. And so I wrote a column under my ordination name for, I don't know, a year or so, and it was paid in copies. Fortunately, none of those survive. I've been looking, trying to figure out what was right for me. I met Linda and we married. She had 3 kids, and it was a dreadful marriage, but we seemed to be good for other people. And it was, so I'd been married to Leah for 5 years, and now I was married, and I would be married to Linda for 5 years. And during this time, I'm trying to find my place, and with Linda, I attended the Episcopal Church briefly. I kind of liked it. Fell in with independent Catholics, which was kind of a fringe movement of liturgy. Sometimes they call them independent sacramental people. None of this quite really worked for me, but I was looking. I was trying to find a place. The signal feature of the religion section of Warren Brock's Book House was this rack with pamphlets on it, and they were they were great. There's the pamphlet that explained how pyramid inches worked and proved through them that through a calculation of pyramid inches that that Kaiser Wilhelm II was the Antichrist. There's another really great pamphlet which explained that the pyramids were actually built just outside of Dublin, and that through a conspiracy of the Brits and the Romans, they moved it rock by rock to Egypt. And I found a pamphlet from a sermon preached in Baltimore, and I they called it Unitarian Christianity, and I read William Ellery Channing, and I thought I might be able to be that kind of Christian, and I went to an unnamed, very large Unitarian church in San Diego, where I fell asleep during the sermon. But I was interested. I thought there's something, and I liked the coffee hour. I thought the coffee hour was very intriguing. Lynn and I divorced, and I decided to go back up to the Bay Area. I moved into the Sufi Conca, the commune that had been founded by Samuel Lewis. He had since died, and the pudgy person was now in charge. Nice people, way too new age for my personal taste buds, but Jen was there, and she had dropped out of UCLA to join the revolution, moved up with her then husband to the Bay Area. She was a draft counselor when that business went out. I think what she had was these fantasies of, she became a typesetter. She had these fantasies, I think, of belonging to a union shop and, working during the day and then printing subversive literature at night. But what she ended up doing was this kind of weird moment between hot press, with molten lead, and the modern PC. So it was computer driven, but it was the incomplete programming. So things like kerning, how you put letters together to make the illusion of symmetry, was done entirely by eye. Yeah. So she was doing that. She studied a little bit with Starhawk and kind of like that. And then she fell in through friends with the Sufis, but also wasn't very psychic. And so we figured, we found each other. And this is about 43 years ago. And we got married, and then we decided to start a bookstore. I'd been working in bookstores and accumulated a large collection of the nucleus of a little used bookstore. And we started taking trips around the Bay Area, and we got as far as Guerneville. We got seduced by the redwoods, and we opened a little bookstore, Royal Road Books, above a laundromat in Guerneville, which is kind of this gay resort area that has a season, and we made a tiny amount of money in the season, and then we're the poorest we were ever, and we were poor people, and still, there's this point. Actually, shortly before we left to start the bookstore, so I was alone in the meditation meeting room of the Sufi Center in San Francisco. I was sitting on the floor in the Zen style. I'd resumed my Zen style sitting at this point. Suddenly, a man dressed in the robes of the ancient Near East walked up to me. I realized it was Jesus. He looked kindly at me and said, "I have a great gift for you." I felt a wave of joy until he held out his hands, palms towards me. They were bleeding. He took my hands in his, and I felt the pain of the world shoot through my hands. All the pain in the world. In a moment, it was over, but my hands hurt for weeks following. In ensuing years, when talking about the spiritual path, I often cite this experience as an example of Macchio. the hallucinations that sometimes accompany a serious and full-on spiritual path, especially if it involves spiritual disciplines like meditation. A few years ago, I mentioned this to a friend, a teacher in one of the Korean Zen lineages, and she asked me, why do you think it was a Makyo? And I was stopped. Awakening is complex and absolutely the shaking of our foundations, the shattering of our views of what is and what is not, come with all sorts of things around the edges, like visions. I've sat with this and I realized there was a great lesson in this that has continued with me all of my life. This world of tears and laughter that we live in and the great mystery where everything falls away exists together. Something sometimes like parallel dimensions in the same space, but each unaware of the other. Sometimes most powerfully as the same thing, the not two. But often we in this world of divided hearts encounter the other world as if through a shredding veil. Here magic happens. Worlds appear and disappear. And a critical thing, this meeting is a wrenching of all that we thought was so. The snake eating the frog is God. The frog being eaten is God. It can be being crucified. Often it is. The great gift can come as pain, the world's pain, the pain of letting go. Our opening into the not two. So then we were moved off to Sonoma County and opened Royal Road Books. And one of the people who came to, I started a little Zen group. I decided it was time to resume my practice. And one of the people who came was Jim Wilson. He had formerly been a monk in the Korean Zen lineage, Sungsan. He left the order when he realized that he had become a monk to avoid accepting his homosexuality. By the time I met him, Jim had found a life partner and was just looking for a nice group to sit with. In one aspect, his Zen training was substantially different than mine. He had studied koans. Koans are questions one engages under the guidance of a spiritual director, and this intrigued me mightily. Although Jim had extensive training with koans and in fact was a former abbot of a Zen temple, he was not authorized to teach. I kept asking Jim to give me a koan. It was maybe the 20th time I'd asked. He sighed and asked me, everything returns to the one. To what does the one return? I looked at him. I looked at the books lining the walls. I looked up at the bare light bulb. I looked out the window at the trees and sky. I smelled the smells of that river town, dust and gasoline fumes. I heard the traffic outside, and I knew. And I told Jim. Something deep within me clicked. I instantly knew I had found my primary spiritual discipline. I knew from the depths of my bones that this discipline would be at the core of my spiritual life. I studied koans with Jim for almost 2 years. After which he said, I'm kind of done. And Jan and I had come to a point where we were the poorest we'd ever been. I mean, it was really, really, really bad. And we realized Jan was in a dying profession, and I could go to any city in the country and get a $7 an hour job. So we decided we would put each other through school. And she had just over 2 years at UCLA, and I was a high school dropout. I had accumulated, I had been taking class, when I worked in Warren Brock's, I took classes at the evening college, and by accident, I had accumulated 2 years of undergraduate, almost a perfect match for an English major. So we began a program where we put each other through school and going forward. For me, but before that, I think, well, I'm working in we sold our books, the stock of our bookstore. We didn't sell a bookstore, and I went to work in a bookstore to make a little bit of money. During this time, I was trying to figure, okay, I needed a koan teacher, and I needed somebody I could click with. I looked, at what was on the horizon, and I decided that the only person that really worked for me was somebody named Robert Aitken. And he was a social justice activist and one of the first convert Zen teachers, Zen masters in a koan school, except he lived in Hawaii. So I wrote him a long, sad letter, and and he never responded, the bastard. Uh, uh, but the day I mailed the letter, a couple walked into the bookstore that I was working in, and guy and a gal, and the guy said, "Do you have anything interesting in Orientalia?" And I said, "We have a ghost story by Lafcadio O'Hearn with hand-colored plates." And he said, "Oh, let me see it." And so went to the locked case and pulled it out. And he said, "How much?" He said, $100. And this is what, early 1980s. And he said, "I'll take it." And then I said, "Well, for yourself?" He said, "No, a gift." I said, "Oh, a gift for whom?" And he said, "My teacher." And I said, "Oh, teacher of what?" And he was his name was John Tarrant. He was a student of Robert Aitken, and he'd just come over to finish his doctoral, the residency for his doctoral program. And we arranged to have, I said, "I just sent your teacher a letter." And I didn't know yet the bastard wasn't going to respond. And we arranged to have coffee the next day. And then I learned that when he came over, he had been authorized to teach as a junior teacher. He was a year younger than me, which really annoyed me. He was brilliant. He was also, you could see recklessness in his aura. And I knew he would be trouble. Then I heard Sung San, the founder, the Korean teacher who had been the former Abbott's teacher, was going to come to Berkeley to lead they don't call him Sesshin in Korean, they call him Yangmyeong-jin, which apparently means intrepid sitting. And although colloquially, to leap like a tiger while sitting. And so I can't remember now if it was a 5 or a 7 day, but I went there, and he came like 2 days later, and it was great. I mean, we really clicked. He's really charming, affable, and also brilliant. And I could answer his phone, and so he liked me, and um, but his students, the senior students, one was a professor of English literature at Cal, all spoke in broken English. They were all doing this kind of imitation of the teacher. And I just, I just couldn't do it. And the way I'd phrase it later was that they had kimchi for breakfast. And I love kimchi, but so I returned, and I gave a box of incense to John. And then he started me from the beginning. Yeah. And I metaphorically gave him my robes, and I said, I will not, even though I have a teaching credential, I'm not a teacher, and I will not use that word unless you think I'm a teacher. And we began what would be a 20-year course of study with him, through which I sat endless retreats and did koan introspection practice with him, eventually completing the formal training in that school of Zen. So I'm I think I will skip parts of these things, but I was thinking about doing psychology and social work, something like that. And my son had become incorrigible in his adolescence, so he was sent to live with Jan and me. and we all agreed that we would go to church together. And so he was following his own path, and that didn't really work, except for causing some trouble at the church. Um, 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 I, you know, was having a great time with it. And when Dan O'Neill, who maybe somebody knows, but the minister at the Sonoma County Church said, James, you're not cut out for honest work. And directed me towards seminary. And it's what I, really, it's what I really always wanted to do. So I at the time I looked at Star King, and it just was not, it was not the school for me. And Pacific School of Religion was the school for me. And it was it it was glorious. I still remember arriving there and realizing that PSR had, in addition to the MDiv, it offered an academic MA. It was the only school that was allowed to retain one for when they joined the GTU, just because it was like 100 years older than any of the other schools. And I still recall thinking, oh, look, all you have to, would have to do is take an extra year of coursework and write a thesis in my 3 years, and I could get an academic MA along with my MDiv. I don't have a lot of memories from that time, but I have both of the credentials, both of the certificates. And it was kind of wonderful. Let's see. I think I need to skip a few things here. Let me jump up to, there's one thing there was a very formative thing for me during seminary. August of 1990, deep into my clinical pastoral education unit at Pacific Presbyterian in San Francisco. It was the weekend, and I was on call. As the hospital didn't have an emergency room, I didn't think much of it until I was buzzed. I called in and was told to get over as quickly as I could. I arrived and was directed up to one of the 2 operating theaters. Putting on a mask, I walked into the one I was directed to and was confronted with a team surrounding what I soon learned was a 12-year-old girl. No one was there. No one there was interested in me or what I had to offer. So I went into the waiting room. It was filled with family, Cambodian refugees. I announced I was the chaplain. A small woman who was surrounded by women mostly, the men standing in an outer ring, looked up at me as what I said was translated. There was a pause, and then she let go with a string of what I knew was invective. A slightly embarrassed looking older man said, "She's cursing you and God. She wants to know why." I wasn't exactly sure what had happened, but I was sure I didn't have an answer. I replied I didn't know what had happened, but I was there to be with her and the family for as long as they wanted. She lost interest in me, but as the clock ran its course, others did want to talk. Some had questions, more just wanted to say something. My spiritual practice had been mostly one of silence, and my preparation was mostly about listening. And well, that's all I had, and that and bare presence. I felt terrible, but I didn't really have a lot of time to feel bad for myself. They were the deal. Finally, 2 men in scrubs came into the waiting room, an older man and a younger one. I noticed the younger man found his shoes incredibly important. He was unable to raise his eyes. The older man took a deep breath and said they had done all they could, but she never recovered from the heart attack. It was something congenital. No one could have foreseen, and they could not revive her. It took a while for the family to leave. I stayed on, but then just as the last of them were stepping into the elevator, the doors to the only other waiting room flew open. The window shades had been drawn. I hadn't even realized anyone was there until then. But the crowd that left some to the payphone, others to the elevators, and still others to the stairwell, were younger women and men, mostly of European descent, all I noticed dressed expensively, and Tibetan monks, both ethnically Tibetan and of European descent. They were talking rapidly, mostly in hushed voices. Many were crying. The cacophony told me something terrible had just happened. I was confused that there was no Lama listed in the census, prominent or otherwise, and it wouldn't be until Monday that I learned what had happened was that a disgraced guru who had been one of the most senior converts to Tibetan Buddhism had been there registered under his birth name, Thomas Rich, had died from complications of AIDS. I can date this event because he's mentioned in articles and books, and dates marking his life are recorded for easy research. He died on the 25th of August, 1990. The girl, I'm ashamed I can't even recall her name. I think about that, and I write this so many years later, and a child dying of a heart attack, the mother cursing me and God, the stream of Tibetan devotees, each consumed in their own grief. These images all flow together and haunt me. Graduated. I was fortunate. I got to go through the MFC in my middle year. Yeah, so that was kind of a relief. So it was just jumping ahead. My first settlement was in Wisconsin, Unitarian Church North. My mother and auntie had retired. They had very little. My father had died. They had $20,000 in the bank, tiny income stream, Social Security basically, and they were beginning to drain their money. And so we cut a deal. They gave us the $20,000. We bought a house. They came and lived with us and would live with us for the rest of their lives. During my time in Wisconsin, I was an execrable novice minister. They were kind to me anyway. I began writing for First Day's Record, which was a little Unitarian journal, and then I was invited to be on the editorial team that put together the Transient and Permanent in Liberal Religion, which were the proceedings of a clergy conference that we had many years ago. I remembered when you get from writing thing advice, if you make a connection with a publisher, however slight, jump on it. And I wrote them and I said, would you like a book on Zen for Unitarian Universalists? And they said, sure. And I wrote it as fast as I could. I spent 4 years there. I accepted the call to Valley UU in Chandler. And you know, it was deep times. In 1998, my son and then my brother both committed suicide. Both had been accompanied throughout their lives by addiction. Both came to crisis points and found the least terrible way to meet it was to die. My son walked into the woods and took a massive dose of heroin. My brother chose to shoot himself. For my son, I flew to Santa Rosa. My old friend and mentor, Dan O'Neill, conducted the service. It was the last time I would ever see his mother, who has since died. For my brother, I flew out to Santa Cruz to settle things and to arrange a funeral. I conducted the memorial service on the bluff of the ocean where we scattered his ashes. The wind carried them up and covered us all. It seemed sad, funny, and spoke to how things are. It broke my heart that my mother learned of these deaths before her own death later in the year. In the rush of sadness at my mother's death, I realized I was now an orphan, that I was the last of the family. I found myself thinking of that line from Matthew, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the child of humanity has no place to rest. I had Jan without any doubt, but there was something else, another truth. I was an orphan, the last link to a flow of history that created those who created me. There's an image, the vermilion thread. It's a part of a koan. Why are perfectly realized saints and bodhisattvas attached to the vermilion thread? The vermilion thread is the current of blood, the tie of generations. It is about the messiness of life, not life itself. I felt there are many truths, but a deep and powerful one among them is that my particular strand is shredded, and I remain the last few strands of what for a time was. While I was still there, my first book, This Very Moment, was published by Skinner House. I was authorized to teach as a junior teacher in my Zen lineage. I accepted the call to the first Unitarian Society in Newton, Massachusetts, and the family, we moved to Newton. Jan, I can remember still when I first said to Jan, I really want to throw my hat in for this church in New England. After she said some very unkind things, she said, "Who knows? Maybe I could end up working at Perkins." And she had, when we were in Arizona, her first job was in a deafblind library. And she became even though it paid so badly, she ended up going to work for the Mesa Public Library. But she was deeply interested in accessibility issues, and especially deafblind things, and sat on a couple of boards for the Arizona Library Association. And Perkins is the school that when Mrs. Keller didn't know what to do, she wrote to them and they sent her Annie Sullivan. And while the Miracle Worker is a lovely movie in many ways, Annie Sullivan did not figure out how to teach a deafblind person. She was taught it at Perkins School. She improved it. She's worthy, and a great story that wish we had time for. And Jen so we arrived there. She immediately got a job in one of the local public libraries when somebody sent her a note saying the job's open. And there was one job that really would have been appropriate for her. It was a research. This is a big institution, and it was a research library that has the world's largest English language collection of non-medical books on blindness and deafblindness. And she's demurred. She just got a job. She's never quit a job a week into it. And and I said, just send them your resume. And a week later, she had to quit her job. But she had been there 2 weeks. And it's a cult, as you might imagine. It's founded by Unitarians, and it's an amazing institution. And she found her work. While I was there, a box of books appeared, and they'd been sent to me in Arizona and then shipped up. And I opened it up, and they were all from a publishing house called Wisdom Publications, and which is kind of a wonderful nonprofit. It's wholly owned by the Foundation for the Propagation of the Mahayana. They were originally the Dalai Lama's vanity press, and they did books exclusively on Buddhism, originally exclusively Indo-Tibetan, and then gradually anything, turns out that's a very tiny market. And anyway, and they wanted to, and the cover letter was that they were looking for writers who had authorization in the Koan lineage, in which I had an authorization. I sent a proposal. The contact person said, "This is dreadful, but maybe I could study Zen with you." And then I eventually, I realized that I'd done all this research for my MA, and it ended up my lead professor retired, and I couldn't continue into doing the thesis, and I ended up having to expand out a thesis from a bloated paper that I had inflicted upon the professor, and he got revenge. But all that research was about the origins of Zen Buddhism in North America, and that became and that's my next book. And it was a history of Zen in North America, called Zen Master Who. joined the Freighters of the Wayside Inn. Then did another book with my senior student, Melissa Blacker, on an anthology on the Book of Mu, which is a kind of an inside book about the probably the central koan in the system. And it's a good book. I was meeting with a student in Doksan, the intensive Zen practice interview, when I realized I could check any koan. This sensation continued for weeks. My sense walking around, sitting alone or with others, was of spaciousness and a profound connection with the whole world, pretty much unabated. It was kind of delicious. While still caught in the luxurious clarity, I found myself sitting in the sanctuary of the First Unitarian Society in Newton. If you have never been there, it's a lovely building, a gem from the ecclesiastical architectural genius Ralph Adams Cram, an English perpendicular Gothic church. Unusual for any Unitarian church, it had an altar with 7 steps leading up to it, and above a lovely stained glass window of Jesus and the little children. I was sitting in the third pew from the altar and stared up at the window. I'd long loved it, sort of the best of Christianity, or at least my dream Christianity. And out of the blue, I recall that line from Chow Cho, when he had embarked on his pilgrimage after his teacher had died. If I see deeper than 100-year-old sage, I'll teach him. If a 7-year-old has something to teach, I will listen humbly. And in a moment, all that delicious inflation, all that knowing I could check anyone's insight dropped from me like an unnecessary winter coat on a clear spring day. In that moment, there was only me sitting in the hard pew, the slight chill in the air, and the unique mix of smells in that old sanctuary, a perfume of forgotten days. And of course, that window illuminated from behind, Jesus, my lovely childhood Jesus, and the children, all the little children, us, all of us, no high, no low, no exceptions. Alan Watts once opined that the universe was, in fact, God playing peekaboo with himself, herself, itself. Here we find that east many travel toward, or as that place is sometimes called in China, the West, is maybe, perhaps, God. That God, the one who folds and unfolds, who plays an eternal game of hiding and finding, and knowing in the just this. That was it. Just that. Even this moment, just this. I felt every prayer I'd ever prayed had been answered. Everything whispered to me, just this, just this. I realized I didn't need anything more. Everything was complete in all its brokenness. Everything was perfect just as it is. Everything fitted together seamlessly, like that box in its lid. The next year, I received Inca Shome, the final authorization as a Zen teacher from John. I had a sabbatical. When I began the sabbatical, my only sabbatical, I was given an opportunity to teach. I was a visiting lecturer at Meadville for a season, and somebody said, keep in touch with the people who are paying the bills, and suggested I start a blog, and I began something called Monkey Mind, and I found a host, something blogger, I think it was, that even an idiot could do, and that was, I realized, on the 5th of last month, is now 18 years old. Yeah. It got picked up by a portal called Patheos. A couple of years after it began, and it's continues to this day. I was there 8 years, I believe. 6 of them were wonderful. If it were 10, it probably would have been a negotiated resignation. But I got back from this sabbatical, and I realized that it was not going to be a happy time. I announced I was leaving at the end of the year, fulfilling my contractual obligation. And Jan really wanted me to look within commuting distance of her cult. So I did, and I drew a couple of things out to California, but wasn't too serious. And Providence uh, uh, needed, actually, it was interesting because as I felt fairly transparent. I was willing to, I knew who I was, I knew what I brought, and I knew what I was not good at. And I was able and Providence needed my skill sets and was uninterested in my deficits. And um, um, we moved there. It was a dreadful commute for Jan, but it was acceptable to her. It was 2 hours each way.
Wow.
It involved the train, the bus, and walking. The train part was, she worked on the way in and did her own thing, enjoyed herself on the way back. We loved Providence. We loved Providence. And it was just this kind of wonderful time. The church was one of the two churches in the districts that was growing. And I asked, one of the younger people who were coming, and they'd dress up and they'd come in significant numbers. Okay, yeah, so historic building is a beautiful building. Google it if you haven't been there. And dead white guy music done to the nines. The music director was uh, the concert master at Brown University. It was, well, when I first arrived, he kept complaining. He said he's holding the choir to 20 because he just can't handle more people in the thing. And when I left, he was complaining that he's going to hold the choir to 40 because he couldn't handle them. Dead white guy music done at pretty close to professional level, and a heady Buddhist sermon from a guy in a robe standing up in on 15 feet in the air, and the response was, can you put robes on the choir? And I was thinking there's some kind of neo-traditionalists, they wanted absolute freedom of conscience, but they wanted, and the walls seeped history. They plotted the revolution in that building. It's kind of something. Well, in that congregation, the building burned out, it's rebuilt. But marriage equality was in the air, and it was kind of at that point. It was still all of New England except Rhode Island had either legislated or voted, and it was a legislation thing, and the Roman Catholic Church was adamantly opposed to it. And First Unitarian, we're a cult out here. There they used to run things, and so it has a place. When I was installed, the governor sent a note. No, a governor sent a note apologizing for not being able to come, and declared it a day and things. The mayor was there. Both of the Congress people were there. It was just tied in. We became the center for marriage equality and this gathering spot for it. It was a glorious time, and I got to witness it happen. Before the Supreme Court. Good years. Finally, Jan, even though I probably was good for another couple of years, and Jan, I know would have liked to stay 5 or 10 more years at her job. Mom's health began to decline enough that she was worried. Her father had died while we were out of state, and it almost killed her. And we retired, and we came home, and we looked around. We were trying to find what to do. We tried to actually put out feelers, trying to find people who want to do cooperative housing or any kind of things, and the timing was not right. A couple of people said, and we did it to Unitarians, and Zen our two communities. And a couple of people said, well, if it was in the Bay Area. Yeah. Uh, um, we had first been to Long Beach for General Assembly, whenever that was, and walked around and really liked it. And we actually, I remembered vividly looking at a condo and pulling out one of those little information sheets for a unit that was in the building. We ended up buying a condo 3 blocks from that condo, and we had 9 lovely years there. It was about an hour, a little more than an hour from Mom, but close enough. My mother had died while we were, as I said, while we were in uh, Arizona. Auntie lived for 20 with us for 20 years and died. It was when we bought the condo, it was 2 bedrooms and Auntie's room, but she died just before we moved. We still called it Auntie's room. Um, um, my book, Introduction to Zen Koans, really should have been Introduction to Zen Meditation and Koans, but I didn't pick that title. And that came out at that point. Other things happened. I got an off while we were in Long Beach. I got an invitation to be from a spiritual tour company to be the entertainment for a trip to Bhutan, and I declined. I said, I don't know nothing about Tibetan Buddhism, and B, I'm old and fat, and I need to know where the next bathroom is. And they wrote back and they said, we want you, and it's free. Did we mention it's free? And we will pay you a little bit of money to go. And the head guy said, I'm old and I know where all the bathrooms are. And so it was a glorious, I mean, it was really a wonderful trip. We gathered in my only trip to East Asia. We gathered in Bangkok, and I arrived a couple of days early, and through social media and friends of friends, I found a retired academic and his wife who took me on the two things I really wanted to do. I got to see where Thomas Merton died, and which was a little hard to put together, but I did, or they did. And there's an English writer on Buddhism, John Blofeld, who was very important to me, and I got to visit the Chinese monastery where his ashes are interred, which was kind of a hoot in Thailand. And then the third thing they did on their initiative is they gave me a tour of Buddhist Bangkok. And it was just lovely. We flew to Bhutan, and it was, life-changing. I commend it to anybody, even if you have to pay. I had a little sitting group that sat in the Long Beach church when Mitra was the minister. I always felt a little awkward because there was another Zen group in the White Plum, which did it did the same koans we did and everything. And they were honest renters. And so I went to Costa Mesa, rented for a while in Costa Mesa. And then when the Anaheim church came open, I was their consulting minister for a year, and for a large part of my compensation was a place for our Zen group. And then COVID hit. And we closed down the sitting group as a physical, moved online entirely. As COVID ended, I did a 3-year consulting with Los Angeles. Just a wonderful little group, and I wish I had time to talk about them. When I left there after 3 years, I realized I really was done. I no longer had serious fantasies about accepting a call somewhere. Um, um, and we, and mom, last year, she's still in pretty good shape, but she's 97, and we moved in with her uh, um, sold the condo. Um, Not, she has one nice bedroom and three little bedrooms, and knocked a passageway between two of the little bedrooms, and we created our nest. And so we're 70 somethings living with mom. And it's actually, we're largely enjoying it. We've started attending neighborhood church, and Omega invited me into as an affiliated minister, so I still feel that connection. I have quit all organizations that I belong to, Zen and Unitarian, except um, uh, um, this cluster, and this area, whatever we call ourselves, the former district, and the American Zen Teachers Association. That's it. Um, um, Book came out. The blog continues. Uh, um, I've started writing a Substack column, and it's really been fun. I think I'm pushing on 6 months now. Uh, um, I can't say how gratifying the tiny amount, the money has actually stopped being tiny. It's become small. And 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 I I think I have just under $7,000 worth of. I've never made that from any book I've written. It's just, it's just kind of delightful. I have another book coming out. I was just last week told the 27th of May. The title, you can mark it, is Zen at the End of Religion. Actually, my first book went out of print, from Skinner House, and it was an introduction to Zen. And I read it, and I was thinking, it's not a bad book. And then I thought, and it's not the book I'd write today. So I wrote that book, and then Shambhala wouldn't look at it because they want 6 months of sales before they consider a second book from an author. And so I went to Monkfish, which is a little house who's done a couple of books I admired. And they looked at it and said, we're really interested. Could you rewrite it to the title, Zen at the End of Religion? An introduction for the curious, the skeptical, and the spiritual, but not religious. I said, basically, that's where you were going. And I said, sure. And so that's coming out on the 27th of May in 2025. And then I have one last thing, if I hope that's okay to share. Trying to pull this together in some manner. A number of my early readers for that introduction to Zen commented on the Christian references in it. One noticed straight out that it was Christian Zen. The confusion for me was that I never saw it that way. I thought I was simply enriching a straightforward Mahayana Buddhist perspective. And if there were any departures from an orthodox Zen Buddhism, it was of a rationalist inclined sort. I was writing from what I'm coming to think of as my spare Zen Buddhism. But it wasn't one reader. And then I found myself talking with a dear friend, a Soto Zen priest. I congratulated him on deciding to begin koan introspection work with a teacher I love and respect. He volunteered, somewhat embarrassed it seemed, that he didn't ask me for two reasons. One was my apparent refrain that I'm getting old and more about ending things than starting things. The second, which he insisted wasn't the big thing, but included was your, quote, Jesus thing. I have an oft-repeated summary of my faith stance. I claim a physiology of faith, tip of the hat to Erasmus, a Buddhist brain, a Christian heart, and a rationalist, naturalist stomach. In my life, this comes together as a song with several blending melodies. As to the brain part, I unpack this as meaning my basic understanding of the world and the human condition is that spare Mahayana Buddhism. It's a version of the three seals. My working hypothesis for reality is that one, everything is made of parts. Everything made of parts will at some point come apart. Two, there are no essences to things. They are composed in a moment when causes and conditions gather and cease when the conditions change. Three, human hurt arises as we misunderstand the nature of the world and our minds and hearts and grasp too tightly at what is passing. And four, yeah, I did say there were three, but yeah. It becomes, when we say the seals, it becomes the four seals. There is a way through this to a peace that passes all understanding. Another of those Christian illusions. I know this isn't right. This is further enriched by my understanding of the two truths and the three bodies. The two truths, as I understand it, is the observation that this phenomenal world where you and I live, the world of history and of consequences, is exactly identical with that place usually called emptiness, boundlessness. The three bodies describes our encounters of the fundamental realities, including this historical world of pain and joy and the empty world. But it notes the third place is wonder as well, a place of dream and wonder. And that's where the heart thing happens for me. I have a simple anecdote to introduce this. I don't think I actually said it, but I learned to read from a large illustrated King James Bible sitting on my grandmother's lap. When not too long ago, I heard George Santayana's line, "There is no God, and Mary is his mother." I instantly understood it. If the world is made of stories, the stories I know from the core of my bones come from the Bible. I say that I dream Moses and Miriam, Jesus and the Marys. It's often literally true. And finally, there's that rationalist disposition. I am a child of the Western Enlightenment. I look at the natural world and I see enough. I hear theistic friends who say they look at the majesty and grandeur of the cosmos and assume there must be a God. I witness the same things and feel awe. But I simply do not see a logical connection between what I witness and some assertion of a human-like mind behind it. But I do love that there are those who are life committed to unpacking the mysteries of the mechanisms. Knowing the how is a wonderful thing. And the world I live in is an unfolding mystery. It's informed by the scientific investigation of things. In our corner of the universe, it follows pretty straightforward laws. Although I'm told by smart people, those laws may not apply everywhere and at all times. Still, if someone makes an assertion about the world of or the human condition, for me, a very good test as to whether that assertion is true is what is the evidence for the assertion. And if there is no evidence, or if the evidence is strictly anecdotal, my response is extremely skeptical. So I'm not simply a materialist. I find those who embrace the term too often reductionists. I also notice often the great scientists are kinds of mystics, if in most cases of a naturalistic inclination. What I've come to find in this life is how we all build worlds out of our stories, vastly more than from facts, as in those things that can be tested. A truth I've found universally applicable. At this stage of my life, living in a world, this world, accepting the natural, embracing it with all my being, I allow it to teach me through those stories to inform and direct my life. The first of those stories is that guidance from those four seals, a truth. The truth that lives within my being is how I see the world is, the unfolding of the mystery. So with that, the next question, how to live this. The next among those stories is the unfolding out of my culture's ancient root wisdoms found in the narratives of Judaism and Christianity, with the odd adjustment from the stories of Islam, especially those Sufis, and also over the many years enriched and directed from the stories of the Zen tradition, most especially those enshrined in the koan literature, driven into my being, framing my being through the disciplines of the koan way. The koan way, the question that contains its answer, the pointer in the invitation, the way of the deep. It is learning to live with what is as it unfolds as it is. And through the gift of my three-body problem, I have a life. From one angle, I'm a rationalist and a naturalist. From another, a pretty straightforward Zen Buddhist of a koan school. And from another, a child of Jesus and those Marys. I'm kind of an atheist, but I don't fear God language. I know to take off my shoes when I approach the mystery. The mighty one for me is beyond all categories. My God is a pregnant emptiness, the nothing that is constantly birthing the worlds. And that God calls with each breath, with every out-breath, my longing and my hope. Out of that beautiful gift of a sense of a natural world, out of the deep wisdom of the Buddha and Nagarjuna and my Zen ancestors, I'm given a way to understand my dream worlds of Moses and Jesus, and especially of our Mother Mary, who is also Guanyin. I notice the ecstatic gift. And this is where I live with my rational heart, my great lens through which to engage with the invitation of the Koan Way, dreaming the world through those stories of Scripture. And I notice the call to serve, symboled most of all by the poor and the left behind. The call of this broken world, so full of pain, so full of love, and a life to be lived.